Hello, botanists. We are here to talk about the biological species concept today, also hybridization and how that kind of fits in with this concept. Now, over the past, or a couple lectures ago, I kind of tried to convince you that there's really no definition of the word species. In the last lecture, I showed you how someone found a new species. So, how did that happen? How did somebody find a new species if they weren't able to define it? And I kind of convinced you about that too. We have this massive problem that I've been trying to convince you of for the past few lectures. We don't have a definition for this word species, yet we, as a race, species, are so dependent on this word species. It's really a gaping hole. That's what I mean by a morass. Because we have these problems. We have the endangered species concept. We've got legalities over these species, right? But how do we know when taxonomists find species? And what exactly are species, right? And those are two different questions. What I mean by how do taxonomists find species, how do they know when they have a species? And that I convinced you of the other day. Remember the story of Dr. Michael Messler and the Prosartes species that he kind of resurrected. He found this set of correlated differences. So these traits that were kind of unique to this group of organisms, and other organisms did not have these. Now, okay. Also, he used genetics to kind of take it home, if you will. So yeah, taxonomists, they know when they have a species from these various ways. But again, how do they define the word species or the idea of species? Okay. Well, folks over the past 100 or so years have been attempting to do this. They've been trying to define the word species. Literally dozens and dozens of propositions have been published. And here are a few of the kind of most popular ones that really kind of survived the test of time. But the biological species concept is by far the most well-known one. And this is the one we're going to talk about. But if you're interested in learning about any of these other ones, please Google search them. They're very interesting. Biological species concept. We're going to talk about the definition of it, why do people like it, the appeal, and then does it even work? So the biological species concept is a definition that was thought of by Ernst Mayr, who lived to be over 100 years old, and he described a species as groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from one another. Now, this is appealing. It makes biological sense, right? It's kind of a lot of big words, sort of, but it makes sense. These groups who are breeding with each other, and they're not breeding with other such groups. Great. It also promises an explicit way to find species in the sense of searching for a reproductive isolation. This is what the definition promises, is that if these are two different species, then they will be reproductively isolated from one another. And so we can test that. We can see if these two have some sort of reproductive barrier from one another. And see if if they don't have a barrier from one another, then they are compatible, right? Okay. So a kind of diagrammatic look at this definition, the biological species concept, it's really two main things. You've got interbreeding populations. These individuals are breeding amongst themselves. And that's what these red lines the individuals within these red lines represent. And then the fact that there are two separate red lines. This is the reproductive isolation. So we don't have individuals from this, from this group interbreeding with individuals from this group. It's not happening because of that reproductive isolation. Now, maybe an easy way to think about reproductive isolation is, say, a river forms and flows between the two, and now these two plants or whatever, they are snails or something, they're not able to interbreed anymore because, say, they can't get their gametes or bodies on the other side of this river. That would be a really kind of clear example of reproductive isolation. Okay. So what does this kind of look like in reality? Well, there's an ancestral population, right, of individuals. And say there's maybe two kind of ecotypes. Maybe the easiest way to think about this is if there is a geographical separation of these, say, two populations. And that's what I mean by the word allopatric. Allo means other, patric means place. So allopatric really means a different place. So these two groups of organisms now are separated, and they are not mating between each other. And then what happens is one of these groups will start accumulating mutations and characteristics that might be different from the other group who it is now separated from. And say if enough of it, once these two have been separated, this red line represents the reproductive barrier. So now, like I said, they are in a different place. Their gametes are not able to make it from one individual to the other in different populations. And so they are effectively reproductively isolated. And over time, they're going to continue accumulating these changes. And they might end up being very different. So this makes sense. This is how the biological species concept kind of works. But what about when there's not so much of a hard barrier here? Maybe this red line is kind of like a dotted line, and actually maybe a few number of individuals are able to make it from one population to the other. Like, how separate do they really have to be in order for these two to be separate species? And this is where the biological species concept doesn't work perfectly for plants. So what happens in nature is this thing called hybridization. So does the biological species concept work for plants? Yeah, more or less, but there are some issues with it. Plant species hybridize. What I mean by that is if we have two separate species who are actually able to interbreed, that's what hybridization is, when we've got these two things that are well known as species and they come together and they make some offspring. It's crazy. It's like two different species for parents. And then another issue with this concept with plants is that checking for reproductive isolation is not practical. What I mean by that is there are 350,000 species of angiosperms. And so the only real way to check for reproductive isolation would be to literally hand cross them all to see if they are intercompatible, at the very least in the lab, and then you'd have to take it to the field. Well, we know the sperm and the egg cell are able to produce a viable zygote in the lab. Now, does this happen in the field? We can't do that for all combinations of 350,000 species. Sheer number of cases that would have to be checked, it's implausible. More about this hybridization, because this is sort of the bigger problem, right? If we've got these two things that we're calling species, yet they're able to interbreed, then that means that there is no reproductive isolation between them, you see? And then it fails, the biological species concept. Okay. So the hybridization, though, it does happen a lot in nature. It's not rampant, though. It turns out it's not a huge issue. So we can still sort of use the biological species concept even though hybridization happens. The basic conditions for hybridization to happen is, well, first of all, they need to be living in the same area. So for this to be a natural hybridization event, then pollinators, right, or wind, would have to get pollen from one individual species to another individual in a different species, which means they'd have to be in the same place. And that's what this word sympatry means. It means same place. Okay. They also have to be very close relatives, right? You can't have a magnolia crossing with a buttercup. These are not close relatives. And so you can't have this like butterolia. It won't happen. They have to be close relatives. They've really got to be in the same genus. And even sometimes that's not good enough. So what hybridization can kind of look like is, say this is we've got these two species, A and B. They're clearly different in color. They're also different in the petal spur length, the petal spur width. That's what these whiskers represent on this figure. So here, these would represent the petal spur length, and then these would be the petal spur width. So notice that the species B does not have a petal spur at all. Okay. If these two if they don't have a reproductive barrier, if they are interfertile, then they will produce offspring. But then the question is, are those offspring good? Are they viable? Will they be able to produce offspring? Are they fertile? If they are able to produce offspring, is it only within themselves, or would they be able to back cross with individuals from the original parent species? What I mean by F1 here, by the way, is the next generation. So F1 is the offspring of the original generation here being the parent species A and B. Well, yeah, sometimes hybrids, say the next generation, F2, if you will, sometimes those original hybrids are able to back cross with the original parents, making this whole variety of different forms of intermediates between these two species. And when this happens, we call this a hybrid swarm. So the hybrid swarm would just be those individuals in the middle that are sort of intermediates between the parent species. These are later generation recombinants, so like F2, F3 generations. We'd be seeing potentially dozens of combinations of these different traits. Here's what this could look like in real time. What I've got in this picture is, we've got these two that are labeled P. Those are for the parent species. These are Mimulus lewisii and Mimulus cardinalis. By the way, that name Mimulus is now dead. More on that next week. And this picture right here in the middle on the top row is the first generation, F1. This is what all of their offspring look like. But F2 in this next generation, so when these hybrids mated with individuals from either of the parent species or with themselves, then you see this massive variety of intermediates between the two original parents. Pretty cool. So hybridization happens. It happens in the field, and you might come across some trilliums like I've got in this picture, and they're pink, and you're like, wow, look at all of these different species we've got here in the left picture. Well, if you're a trained botanist, you would notice these are not all individual species. But the only way you would know that is if you know the parent species, and you know that hybridization could happen between them. So really, it's all about kind of being a good taxonomist here, and knowing your local taxa, knowing potential compatibilities between them. Okay. Here's just another cool example of hybridization in the field. These are two different species of California aqualesias, and apparently where their ranges overlap, they are able to, say, kind of share pollinators and produce hybrids. Here's yet another example. Delphiniums. We know Delphinium, this genus. Remember the guard petals, right? Delphinium comes in a few different colors, but only this one and this one in this picture are actual described species. This one that's in the middle is a hybrid between those two species. And in the field, in fact, you can see this at Gray Falls Campground, where I mentioned a couple of lectures ago. Gray Falls is about an hour inland off the 299 on the left-hand side. I've seen this hybrid at Gray Falls before, and it absolutely blew my mind. I screamed, shrieked, and fell prostrate. But I have never seen this kind of swarm quite like this. I just kind of saw one that looked just about like that. Anyway, these two species are widespread in that area. They're very closely related species in the same genus, and so when pollinators are sort of using both, then they are producing these viable offspring. And yes, these viable offspring are able to cross back with the parent species. And so we have this hybrid swarm. And so again, the whole point of me talking about this hybridization is that when we have these two things that we're calling species, yet they are able to interbreed in the wild, then technically they do not fit the biological species concept definition of the word species. And so that's kind of a problem, but it's also okay. Like, I as a taxonomist, I'm okay with this. I'm still comfortable calling these two original delphiniums separate species. Because it's not like this happens all the time. This is a pretty rare event of natural hybridization. Okay. So what keeps these closely related species from hybridizing all the time? Or, in other words, what stops hybridization? Why isn't hybridization more rampant across plants? Well, the vast majority of species combinations out there have some sort of hard isolating factor. So either biochemical or developmental barrier. So like a pollen tube won't germinate. Say when this pollen grain lands on a stigma, maybe the female part of the plant won't allow it to produce a pollen tube, or maybe the pollen tube starts and then the female part of the plant kind of stops that growth. Or maybe zygotes will form, but they won't be able to divide, or maybe it's further than that. The zygotes divide, they're able to make a fully bona fide individual adult plant, yet those adult plants are not able to reproduce. That would be another hard isolating barrier. But sometimes these isolating factors are not as hard. We call them soft isolation barriers. These are sort of ecological reproductive barriers. Like, we've got these two closely related species, they live in the exact same place, yet they use different pollinators, and so we don't see rampant hybridization in the field. Or maybe it's sort of just slight differences of soil. So we've got these two closely related individuals, but this one's only able to grow on serpentine, and this one's only able to grow on non-serpentine, for example. Okay, so I have, although not absolute, these ecological barriers can restrict hybridization and maintain species differences. So no, I am not going to pose a better definition of the word species now. I've just kind of posed the definition to you and then argued it away. But I'm also trying to convince you that it's still okay. This word species, it's okay. We're going to be okay if we can't perfectly define it. There's plenty of other words out there in the English language and all other languages that we can't perfectly define. It's a problem with language. We try to put words into this black box where everything that's in this black box perfectly defines the word and nothing that's outside of this box defines this word. But really, it's hard to define lots of words, right? Politics, religion, we see this all of the time. Species is just like that. Okay, see you next time.